Why Steve Forbes is wrong about inflation. Everyone knows that inflation is bad. It raises prices, and it makes you feel like a loser who's getting shafted by the Tooth Fairy and Santa Claus. But what is inflation? What causes it? And how can we fight it? These are all great questions, but before we dive into them, let's look at some basic definitions first. What is inflation? Inflation is a sustained increase in the general level of prices of goods and services in an economy over a period of time. It's measured by comparing the cost of goods and services across time, or across countries, or both. There are many ways to measure inflation, the most common being using consumer price indices, CPI. The CPI tracks changes in consumer prices from one month to another, but doesn't include housing costs or rental property expenses. It does also account for changes at different points on your life cycle, newborns versus infants versus toddlers versus preschoolers versus elementary school kids. Measuring inflation. Measuring inflation is a tricky business, and there are several different ways to do it. The most common way is to calculate the Consumer Price Index, CPI, which measures changes in the price of goods purchased by consumers. The Bureau of Labor Statistics, BLS, computes this index by tracking how much money you would have to spend today on something like food or shelter in order to buy it at its current price level. If prices rise more than that amount, then inflation has occurred. If they fall below that amount, then deflation has occurred, and this measurement can be adjusted over time as new data becomes available or old data is revised based on new information. The BLS also publishes another measure called Gross Domestic Product Deflator, GDPD, which tracks changes in real GDP over time instead of just nominal GDP numbers. That means comparing what money buys now with how much it could buy back then when comparing two periods within 1 year's worth of economic activity instead of measuring everything from 1 year ago until now based solely off historical trends with no consideration given for short-term fluctuations caused by events such as natural disasters which might temporarily raise prices despite overall economic growth remaining steady across all industry sectors simultaneously throughout these same periods. Causes of inflation. You may have heard that inflation is caused by too much money. This isn't exactly true. It's usually caused by one or more of the following. Demand pull inflation, a rise in the demand for money, which causes prices to rise because there's more of it floating around. For example, if you have a lot of customers who are using your business card but don't have enough cash on hand to pay their bills at the end of each month, or even at all, then you'll likely see an increase in prices as more people use your cards instead. Cost push inflation, when suppliers raise their prices in order to cover rising costs associated with increased production output or greater demand for a product type. This can also happen when wages go up so much that workers need higher salaries just to maintain their standard living standards after adjusting for inflationary pressures like cost push increases. The imperfect Phillips curve. The Phillips curve is an economic theory that describes the relationship between unemployment and inflation. The Phillips curve shows that there can be a positive correlation between these two variables, that is, when unemployment goes up, so does inflation, and vice versa. There are several different versions of this theory, but all of them agree on one thing: there isn't a perfect relationship between these two variables. Unemployment will always rise with an increase in prices. But what happens when you add more data points? The first thing you need to know about this graph is that it's not supposed to accurately depict reality. Instead, it's meant as a guide for policymakers who want to make decisions about how much stimulus money should go towards helping people find jobs or otherwise improve their lives during economic downturns, like we're seeing now. In other words, don't use these numbers as gospel. If we did so blindly without knowing anything else about our economy, then we'd be throwing away billions every year because we weren't factoring in other factors like foreign demand for our products or trade relationships with other countries, which could affect our exports negatively if they decline due to low demand domestically. Managing inflation. Steve Forbes is wrong about inflation. He says that the Fed should stop manipulating interest rates and instead focus on managing inflation. But he doesn't understand how inflation works or why it's important to manage it. In fact, there are many ways in which the government can impact prices: through fiscal policy, the federal budget, monetary policy, the Federal Reserve, or both. The private sector plays an important role as well. Companies try to make profits by charging more than they cost their customers, but only if consumers accept those higher prices and don't switch brands or stop buying altogether. Finally, there are two types of consumers: consumers who face price increases due to economic factors like supply constraints, which is rare, or demand shifts caused by events like natural disasters. These people have no choice but pay whatever price is demanded by producers unless they get help from government programs such as food stamps or Medicaid. Concluding thoughts. It's a complex issue. The idea that inflation is just about printing money is wrong, but there are many ways to solve inflation. We need to be careful not to overreact and end up with a worse problem than what we have now. React and